Chapter 13. Towards a New World Order. 1990-2000. Never before in such a short space of time had so much happened. Never before had history known a period of such profound changes as the last decade of the 20th century. The world changed utterly. Suddenly, the East-West tension ceased to have importance with the demise of the USSR after the turmoil which Mikhail Gorbachev unleashed. In 1990, the Baltic republics gained their freedom. Armenia sought independence. Disputes arose with Azerbaijan, and Georgia declared itself a state. At the end of 1991, the last Red Tsar obtained sweeping powers from the Soviet parliament. But it was also too late for him. The victory of Boris Yeltsin in the presidential elections in the Russian Federation left him out of the political game, and the coup of August, organized by those nostalgic for communism, marked the beginning of a new era. Everything was to fall apart. The Communist Party was made illegal and the KGB disappeared. And in December of the same year, 11 of the former republics gave way to the Community of Independent States. Over 1991, the USSR was divided up into 15 states. Although during early 1992 nobody knew what was to become of the Soviet nuclear arsenal, the signing of a disarmament agreement between Bush and Yeltsin in January of 1993 cleared up any doubts. However, the nuclear accident in Siberia made it clear that peace also had its risks, perhaps just as terrible as those of war. Yeltsin, who played differently at home than on the international scene, took his country into the Council of Europe in 1996. There was talk of rebuilding the USSR, but it was now too late for that. There was no way out of the chaos. Inflation was the underlying problem. At the end of 1996, a dollar was worth 7,000 rubles. Yeltsin believed that by creating a new ruble, things would sort themselves out, but he was mistaken. Tension between Serbs, Croats and Slovenians was great. In 1991, the last president, Boris Jovic, resigned, and the Croatian Tudjman accused Serbia of creating a climate of war, which was, to a certain extent, true. Things moved very quickly, and in June, Croatia and Slovenia decided to break up the country, a move which brought them into a direct confrontation with Serbia. It was civil war. Bosnia-Herzegovina allied itself with the Croats, and Sarajevo, the Bosnian capital, was besieged. The ethnic persecution recalled Nazi atrocities. Bosnia, which declared its independence, was the fourth republic to break away from Yugoslavia. Their problems worsened. The UN blamed Serbia for encouraging the conflict and prepared a blockade. NATO sent troops to Bosnia. In January 1993, there was talk of dividing up the complex territory into 10 provinces. The US accepted partition, and the conflict flared up again in 1994. The war finished in 1996, although peace didn't exactly begin. Nobody could see a way to put a stop to the crimes, although some of those responsible were sentenced in 1997. Europe took shape when the Single European Act came into effect. The aim was to create an internal market in which goods and people could move freely as of the end of 1992. Germany, due to its unique experience and recent history, was the country which changed most. Gorbachev visited Bonn at what was an important moment psychologically, so that Helmut Kohl could propose reunification. In the spring of 1991, Kohl traveled around the former Democratic Republic, and Berlin became once again the seat of government. With the election of the first president of the reunited Germany, Roman Herzog, in 1994, and the re-election of Kohl for the fifth time, Germany faced a future of economic recession, the price which had to be paid for reunification. Kohl went to Moscow in 1996 with a proposal which Yeltsin did not like, to expand NATO at Russia's expense. Finally, in 1997, NATO would stretch eastward thanks to an agreement which was to be reached at the Madrid summit. At the end of 1998, the Kohl era came to an end. Gerhard Schröder manages to bring the Social Democrats to power after 16 years of Christian Democrat government. The Chancellor for the next millennium announced the SPD's place in a new political center, continuity in foreign policy, and the fight against unemployment as a national challenge. The economy of the UK was under the scrutiny of Margaret Thatcher, who shortly before resigning her position privatised a large number of state companies. Days later, John Major was to take up the post. The IRA gave him a welcome with a couple of bombs in central London. An offer by Sinn Féin was rejected in January 1992, and the attacks continued. There were elections which once again the Conservative Party won. The Treaty of Maastricht was ratified and the pound was taken out of the European monetary system. In 1993, talks are held with the IRA, thus involving Sinn Féin in the peace negotiations. The Crown didn't manage to shake off its problems and the Prince and Princess of Wales ended up getting divorced. The image of Diana improved, whilst that of the Prince plummeted. Diana's romance with the Arab multimillionaire Dodi Al Fayed was seen as offensive by the palace. In 1997, the fatal accident of Prince Charles's ex-wife, surrounded in mystery and suspicion, moved the world and created the legend of the People's Princess. The electoral triumph of the youthful and charismatic Tony Blair's Labour Party in 1997 gave the country certain hope. Blair's greatest success was the deal on Northern Ireland's future, which was ratified by the executive of the Ulster Unionist Party, giving way to peace after 25 years of conflict. In France, foreign policy was affected in 1990 by Mitterrand's nuclear policy and his refusal to reduce his nuclear arsenal. Jacques Chirac is sworn in as the new French president in 1996, the same year Mitterrand dies. In Italy, after the resignation of Ciriaco de Mita, Giulio Andreotti forms a government. Corruption, the shadow of the mafia, student strikes, the confrontations between the president, Francesco Cossiga, and the Supreme Court all combined to form a complex web of difficulties which at the beginning of the decade shocked Italian public life. In January 1992, the parliament was dissolved and months later Cossiga resigned to be replaced in the presidency by Luigi Scalfaro. The mafia carried out attacks on judges Falcone and Borsellino, events which tried the patience of the government. On top of this, there were the investigations into corruption. In 1993, the trial of Bettino Craxi opened. The trial of Andreotti for mafia connections shook the political world. Months later, elections gave Silvio Berlusconi the premiership, which he lost in 1996 to an alliance of the left. In 1992, Barcelona hosted the Olympic Games. In Seville, the Universal Exhibition, or Expo, was held. Seville also saw a new development in high technology, the high-speed train. José María Aznar's Partido Popular won the elections. At the end of 1998, ETA announced an indefinite ceasefire influenced by the peace achieved by the IRA. Elections were held in the Basque Country for the first time without the shadow of violence. The pro-independence movements experienced an increase in their support and the extremists were strengthened. The decade began in an atmosphere of recession and conflict. In the US, dissatisfaction led to a climate of violence which helped Clinton win his victory in 1992. Nobody could have imagined the situation he was to find himself in towards the end of his mandate, thanks to his sexual liaisons with intern Monica Lewinsky. In Latin America, violence, guerrilla war, social injustice and corruption dominated life. But there were advances in the political mood of the continent. When in 1990 the Sandinistas lost power in Nicaragua, Violeta Chamorro came to the presidency in a smooth transition. Neither were there any problems when the left lost again to Arnolfo Alemán. In 1989, unrest in Venezuela provokes the serious incidents known as the Caracazo. The riots leave 400 dead. On February 4, 1992, Hugo Chávez leads a failed armed uprising against the government. Rafael Calderas substituted the socialist Carlos Andrés Pérez, who was found guilty of corruption and robbery. In the 1998 elections, the favorite for the presidency was the former Miss Universe Irene Sainz. However, she lost a lot of voters when she decided to run with Copey, and eventually lost out to Hugo Chávez, who paradoxically won the presidency in a climate of tension. Mikhail Gorbachev received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990, while in 1992 the prize went to the Guatemalan Rigoberta Menchú for her work in favor of the human rights of the indigenous peoples. In El Salvador, Alfredo Cristiani came to an agreement with the guerrilla movements after 12 years of armed struggle. In Guatemala in 1991, Jorge Serrano drew up a pact with the guerrilla organizations in an effort to solve the country's socio-political problems, which finally came to an end in 1996 after 35 years of civil war. In Colombia, peace was signed with the M19, an effort to mend a social and political fabric which was tattered and torn. In 1996, Ernesto Samper, accused of financing his campaign with drug money, called a referendum, but the air filled as it was with suspicions proved difficult to clear. Alberto Fujimori, while president, launched a coup so as to gain wider powers in 1992 in a bid to tackle the Peruvian crisis. He took on the problems caused by the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path guerrillas, whose leader was arrested. Tribunals of anonymous judges caused terror among the populace. In Chile, Pinochet was granted the title of Senator for Life in an effort to gain immunity from possible charges. In a statement, he confessed that history teaches us that dictators never come to a good end. His arrest in London, prompted by an extradition order filed by a Spanish judge accusing him of genocide, terrorism and torture, brought reactions from all over the world. Margaret Thatcher fervently and shamefully publicly defended the dictator. The House of Lords stripped him of his immunity, basing their decision on the fact that torture is not one of the functions of a head of state, thus showing the world that there are increasingly fewer safe havens for dictators. In Argentina, Carlos Menem remained in power, although the municipal elections of 1997 signaled the end of the Peronist majority. In the elections of 1999, Menem will not be a candidate. Whereas at the turn of the century, Zapata's Mexican Revolution reflected peasant unrest, the century was to draw to a close with a new uprising, this time by the indigenous peoples of Chiapas. Reacting against social injustice, the Zapatista army, the EZLN, came into being. The voice is that of Subcommander Marcos, a young university teacher, the only non-indigenous member of the liberation movement. Military harassment is constant. Paramilitary groups terrorize the villages. The world is indignant after the massacre of Acteal. The so-called White Guards kill 45 peasants, and the Federal Army carries out more than 40 raids against villages in their search for Zapatista strongholds. The PRI government tries to deny any link with the paramilitary groups, yet constantly expels international observers in the area to investigate the consistent violation of human rights. In 1990, the Gulf War made clear that conflicts in the Arab world would be a decisive factor to consider in keeping world peace. One of the factors was the increasing support that fundamentalism was gaining in the Arab world, and the violence with which certain leaders defended it. But the key to understanding the world's worries lies in the fact that beneath this region are to be found a significant proportion of the world's oil reserves. One of these oil-producing regions is Kuwait, the fourth largest in the world and the top producer in the Middle East, and whose independence in 1961 was never recognized by Iraq. In August 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded the emirate, provoking wide-scale looting and devastation, the bombing of its infrastructures, mass executions, rapes and tortures. It was not only a bloody venture, but also an ecological disaster. Hundreds of oil wells were set fire to, millions of barrels of crude oil were poured into the sea, causing the destruction of marine flora and fauna as well as the death of the Gulf's plankton. The UN's mediation was in vain, and in January 1991 the war began. 5 days after the airstrikes against Baghdad, Kuwait was liberated. It took General Norman Schwarzkopf only 100 hours to resolve the situation. The madness of Saddam caused 1 million deaths, the spread of famine to the Kurds of the north, the Shiites of the south, as well as affecting the population in general. The surrender included clauses dealing with the destruction of missiles and chemical arsenals and the dismantling of a nuclear plant. Infringements of the terms of this pact were not to be tolerated, and when these occurred, as in June 1993, President Bill Clinton gave the order for a missile attack. 1 year later, Iraq recognized the sovereignty of Kuwait, but continued to lash out at the Kurds, which provoked further interventions in 1996. Iraq was playing a dangerous new game. The expulsions and constant prohibitions of UN observers there to monitor the chemical weapons brought the risk of yet another war. At the end of 1998, the US and the UK carried out Operation Desert Fox in order to severely punish Iraq. The rest of the world were in disagreement. They saw this new war as a smokescreen for Clinton at a time when he was facing impeachment over the Levinsky affair. The Duma approved a resolution mentioning the barbaric attacks of international terrorism and calling for an immediate increase in Russian defense expenditure. There seemed to be some headway in the complicated Palestinian-Israeli conflict. 1 year after the Madrid Peace Conference in October 1991, Ishaq Rabin of the Labour Party won the elections. Jews and Palestinians reached an agreement which made possible the creation in 1994 of an autonomous Palestinian state in Gaza, the West Bank and Jericho. But the process was brought to a standstill by the assassination of Rabin, and the conservative revisionism of Benjamin Netanyahu did little to redirect it. At the end of 1998, after the Maryland agreements, the partial withdrawal of Israeli troops from the north of the West Bank took place, signaling the beginning of a new era for the Palestinians. In Sudan, famine caused by the war made an appearance in 1993. Meanwhile, in Eritrea, guerrilla warfare continued and elections were held. Civil strife between warring clans brought chaos to Somalia. Rwanda and Burundi reached a precarious agreement in 1993, which put an end to the massacres and the brutal death squads. However, months later, tribal fighting flared up once again. The Hutu government fled, and the Tutsis entered Kigali. The frantic Hutu exodus to Zaire, the massacres and hunger killed thousands. 1 million refugees wandered between Rwanda and Burundi. It was an exodus of such enormous proportions that countries such as Zaire were forced to accommodate hundreds of thousands of refugees in 1996. In South Africa, the white hegemony came to an end. In 1990, Nelson Mandela was released from prison where he had spent decades. In 1993, white dominance was ended, although not so the violence between supporters of Buthelezi and Mandela, who after the elections of 1994 became the country's first black president. The death of Teresa of Calcutta moved the world. She was the flower which sometimes blooms in the desert. Computer technologies continued to take over everything and were everywhere. The development of operative systems such as Windows won Bill Gates enormous success, provoking confrontations with the US government, resentful of the accumulation of so much power. Especially when Gates began negotiating with the Russian government to place communication satellites in orbit by making use of the old Soviet arsenal. The leisure society, the reduction of the working day, placed people in the dilemma of what to do with their time. And while we look for that dolce far niente, social conflict is on the rise: drugs, racism, and xenophobia. Unemployment, urban violence, and group rivalries began to exhaust society. From 1996 on, we can detect a certain nostalgia for the swinging 60s and the frenetic 70s. There is a trend in women's fashion towards restraint. The queen of the 90s was Claudia Schiffer. Her image as the perfect woman filled the catwalks, publicity and cinema. This is the era of the top models, the subtle beauty of the Australian Elle Macpherson, the sensuality of the Argentine Valeria Mazza, and the naturality of the Spanish Judith Mascot. American cinema was once again the dream machine. The appearance of silicon graphic stations enabled special effects to be incorporated with a level of realism previously unthinkable. Michael Bay, who had enjoyed great success with The Rock, took on board the millennium tendencies of the end of the century with Armageddon, in which the destruction of the Earth by a giant meteor seemed inevitable. The top stars of Hollywood got together to move into the restaurant business. Planet Hollywood spread all over the world. Technology once again teamed up with cinema, and the quest for new filming and projection systems reached a peak with the development of IMAX in 3D, Omnimax and high definition. The French director Jean-Jacques Arnaud, who had made magnificent films such as The Bear, The Name of the Rose or The Quest for Fire, directed the first feature film in 3D, The Wings of Courage, based on the life of aviator and writer Saint-Exupéry. One of our era's greatest myths returned to the screen thanks to James Cameron. Titanic became the film to win most Oscar nominations in the history of cinema. Celine Dion sang the main theme, My Heart Will Go On, and the soundtrack won the Oscar for musical score. In the world of medicine, there was talk of the anti-heart attack pill and Viagra. But along with these advances, there was a return of illnesses associated with poverty. The WHO registered 600,000 cases of bubonic plague, as if the Middle Ages wished to make a comeback. Moreover, the unstoppable advance of AIDS decimates the population. In December 1993, the space telescope Hubble had to get over its myopia caused by a deformity in its principal lens. Once corrected, it sent images of space, thus opening incredible prospects. Immense clouds of dust were discovered, which explain when and how the universe was born. In 1994, a man beat the record for staying in space. Dr. Valery Polyakov was 438 days at zero gravity, carrying out studies in medicine, physiology, and psychology. The space station Mir suffered some serious malfunctions, which led to fears for the lives of the cosmonauts. In the summer of 1997, repair work was carried out so that it could continue as the chief space station. At the end of 1998, grandfather John Glenn, at the age of 77, returned to space on board the Discovery on a historic mission which recalled the glories of the space program of the 60s and which gave a boost to space exploration. Step by step, humanity was conquering space with the hope of discovering new worlds and making them inhabitable. The new century heralds new and marvelous happenings. To reach Mars becomes an obsession. In 1998, the Nobel Prize for Literature was awarded for the first time to a Portuguese writer, José Saramago. The Vatican expressed its disagreement at this award to the author of the Gospel according to Jesus Christ. In the world of motorsport, two men stood out for their triumphs, Johan Kankkunen and Carlos Sainz. In football, Real Madrid won for the 7th time the European Cup and also won in Japan the Intercontinental title. At the end of the century, the player who caused the greatest sensation was the Brazilian Ronaldo. At this point in history, in which the politicians do not seem to be up to the task, only ecology seems to remain as a banner for those who wish to save a planet which seems to be going out of control. What is to become of the human habitat? Hundreds of species are in danger of extinction, perhaps even humanity itself. If the problem of the hole in the ozone layer of the Antarctic is not tackled, if an end is not put to desertification, forest fires, CO2 emissions, oil spills at sea, and other environmental threats dealt with at the Kyoto summit. Perhaps now the struggle is not for the preeminence of one nation over another, but that of silencing the trumpets, those heralds of the final apocalypse of humanity. The human race, having had the ability to make the world a paradise, has turned it into a rubbish dump, where at times the distant cry of a child maimed by an anti-personnel mine can be heard. Homo homini lupus, man is a wolf to other men. But now, at the end of the millennium, there is something worse still. For now, the most dramatic and stupidest thing is that man is a wolf to his habitat. We have forgotten the wise warning of Franz Kafka. In the struggle between man and the world, one must always take the world's side.